Thomas's life was quite complicated, unlike his housemates. Thomas had frequent scandals with his wife, who got on his nerves a lot. Most of the time, they started for no particular reason. The child also gave Thomas problems when he went out and did not know where he spent his time. Many times, Thomas had to find the child and take him home. There were many reasons for his worries. This is just a tiny part of them. But Thomas always dealt with the problems and paid less attention to them. What happened to Thomas turned his life upside down completely. It robbed him of everything he held dear, and Thomas didn't know how to live with it anymore. Even in scary horror movies, you wouldn't see what lived next to Thomas. He had managed to escape only by miracle and paid a very high price for it. Thomas had a beautiful wife and a young son. They lived in an ordinary 5-story apartment building. It was on the outskirts of town. They lived, worked, and raised their child like any average family. But all this was happening until one moment. One morning, Thomas left the house to take out the garbage. He opened the front door and smelled an unpleasant odor. The stench was like stagnant water, the way a swamp smelled. The dumpsters were located at the end of his house. On his way to them, Thomas stumbled upon the source of this stench. It reeked from an open sewer maintenance hole. The closer Thomas got, the stronger the stench got. Thomas threw out the trash and walked over to the source of the stench. When he looked into the maintenance hole, Thomas realized it reeked of ordinary sewage. He found a large board in the dumpsters and put it in the sewer maintenance hole so no one would accidentally fall in. Thomas was on his way home and had no idea that this sewer maintenance hole would turn into a nightmare for him. It was Thomas's day off, and he was in no hurry. He had nothing important to do that day. The boys in the yard were waiting for Thomas's son, and his son put on his jacket and ran for a walk. Thomas's belongings reeked. His wife could smell it, and so could he. Thomas sent all the clothes into the washing machine. It was the beginning of his typical day. The son would occasionally run in for something to eat and run back out for a walk. Thomas watched the news on TV all day and played games on the computer. Thomas's wife was busy with her beauty routine and watching soap operas. Sometimes Thomas and his wife would scandalize, but for the most part, the day went on as usual. The serenity was abruptly cut short as the sun set over the horizon and the streetlights came on. The child had not yet returned home and did not respond to his wife's call from the balcony. In situations like this, the guys could go for a walk in the neighbor's yard. Sometimes they would go to the woods, which were right behind Thomas's house. It was commonplace in the family, but when the child could not be heard in the yard at 8 o'clock in the evening, the wife sounded the alarm. She called a neighbor to see if her child had come home. It turned out that the neighbor's child had been home for hours. He said all the kids had gone home about 2 hours ago, too. The kid's smartwatch was at home. A call would have been useless. Thomas realized that the smell was fried. They waited for the son until 10 o'clock at night, but there was no sign of him. Thomas and his wife dressed and went out looking for their son. There was silence and no one in the yard. It was freezing outside, and the child did not like this weather and was poorly dressed. They searched and called for the child for a very long time, but to no avail. Thomas and his wife had a bad feeling. Both had heart palpitations and understood that something must have happened to the baby. Thomas comforted his wife for about an hour before calling the police himself. The police showed up in the yard 10 minutes later. The cops interviewed the family and recorded all of the child's parameters. They assured me that all was well, and they had had such calls many times. The cops also called a dog handler with a dog. The dog sniffed the child's jacket and set out together to find the child. But there was little success from these searches. All the yards, basements, attics, and woods were searched to no avail. But when the dog passed by the smelly maintenance hole, it refused to go near it and stayed a few meters away. The dog sat near the dog handler and whimpered. This was suspicious to Thomas, as she had run and sniffed everywhere. The search was discontinued, and even the dog had no results. The wife thought the child might have been stolen, but their family was poor, and a ransom was always required in such situations. The cops reassured the family and promised to do everything possible to find the child, but Thomas kept thinking about the sewer maintenance hole, and the surrounding smell reminded him even more. During the search, no one even looked into it. Thomas reminded the cops about it, and they decided to take a look. He pulled out an inserted wooden board, and one of the cops shined a flashlight. All that was visible was some faucets, and about half a meter of water with some abomination floating in it. Things got even worse from there. An ambulance was called for his wife. She was very sick, had a fever, and was shivering. In general, she was seized by a panic attack. The medicine she had taken helped her, and she fell asleep. Thomas was on the verge of a breakdown, but tried to hold on. The search for his son continued throughout the night. Later, the emergency services were involved and searched every meter. The child was still not found. Thomas was already convinced that something had happened to his son, but what exactly had happened? He did not understand. The night passed excruciatingly long, and Thomas was very sleepy. The cops advised him to do the same, as a tired Thomas was of little use. All in all, the child was not found in the days that followed. The cops continued their search, but the search yielded no results. Thomas's life took a sharp turn in a few days. He didn't even wish what he felt on his enemy. Thomas stopped eating and drinking. He and his wife walked around the apartment like statues and even stopped talking. Thomas didn't know what to do or how to live with it. A few days later, Thomas learned even worse news. They had other children, the same age as his son, missing from their yard. Thomas's child had been walking with them all the time. Police and emergency workers were converging on the yard. There were only more of them. There were theories that a maniac was at work. The cops were perplexed because they had no leads. Thomas was alone at home. His wife was taken to the hospital by ambulance. She became pretty bad and was put in for treatment. Thomas was alone at home. The constantly cheerful and scandalous apartment emptied. It was like a cold cave. He comforted himself with the thought that his child was alive. On the 6th day, his patience ran out, and he went outside. Thomas immediately noticed that it smelled even worse outside. The stench only increased as he got closer to the sewer maintenance hole. Thomas could smell the sweet odor of dead meat near the maintenance hole, and the swampy smell was gone somewhere. He covered his nose and walked past the sewer maintenance hole. But a little distance away, Thomas heard something falling into the water. Thomas returned to the maintenance hole and shined the flashlight on his phone into it. He was instantly shocked. His legs became cotton candy, and he backed away. Thomas saw a child's yellow jacket there. The coat was familiar to him. It belonged to the boy next door. He too had been missing for days. Thomas immediately called the police. When he hung up, he heard footsteps in the water. Thomas got the idea that kids were playing there, and he rejoiced. Thomas covered his nose with his jacket, and he went into the sewer maintenance hole. The smell made him sick. Not even the jacket helped him. He was vomiting profusely. Thomas went down and looked around. At the back, he saw a large hole that led deep underground. His curiosity played tricks on Thomas. He shone his flashlight into the hole, and what he saw shocked Thomas. He saw the corpses of children there. Some of them were intact, and some of the bodies were already rotting. Among these corpses, Thomas saw his son, or rather the remains of his son, as the corpse was already decomposing. Thomas became hysterical, unable to comprehend what he saw. He squeezed further into the hole and heard footsteps on the water. Thomas ducked a little and looked in that direction. From what he saw, he backed away. A few feet away from him stood something incomprehensible. Thomas aimed his flashlight at the silhouette and immediately dropped it in the dead water. A few seconds were enough for him to see some otherworldly creature. It resembled a human being, but it was standing on all fours. The creature was staring at Thomas with a murderous stare. The skin of a face of a child familiar to Thomas stretched over its head. The creature's head was twisted sideways and dressed in children's clothing, which were clearly out of his size. The animal had huge, long limbs, making the water slap. Thomas was in a stupor, not moving and staring at the beast. The creature opened its enormous mouth and let out a piercing scream. Its teeth were rotten and yellow. The riots made Thomas's hair curl up on his head. He realized he couldn't stay here, so he quickly climbed out of the maintenance hole. He was helped out by the cops, who arrived just in time. They were surprised at how I looked, but they were more influenced by what Thomas had told them about what he had seen. The cops didn't believe Thomas at first. When they heard the screaming with their ears from the sewer maintenance hole, they got terrified and drew their service weapons. The cops went down the sewer maintenance hole one at a time. Thomas had had enough and ran home. All night long, Thomas lay with his eyes open. He did not want to sleep. In the morning, his strength left Thomas and his eyes involuntarily closed. After a while, he learned that no one else had seen the cops. They had disappeared without a trace. Thomas didn't know the exact number of children taken out of the sewer maintenance hole and buried. Thomas's house was filled with animal horror, and the tenant's temper was visibly altered. No one knew what it was. Only Thomas and those two cops knew. Thomas's wife went off the rails after the situation. She wanted to hang herself, but the paramedics got there in time. Thomas didn't know how to live with it. The sewer maintenance holes gave him a wild terror for a long time.